The other thing to discuss this week are the military orders. We haven't discussed them before, so who were they? You might have heard of them before. There's lots of misinformation about some of them around there. A lot of them have sort of fallen into legend more than actual history. There's a lot of these different military orders, and they originated in the East. Though, importantly for this week's topic, they were not just in the East. There's kind of a top three. Firstly, the Templars, and they are officially the chivalry of the poor knights of Christ, but they are better known by the name of their house, the Temple of Solomon, hence the Templars. Secondly, there's the Hospitallers, and their official name was the Order of Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. And thirdly, and most importantly for this particular week's class, the Teutonic Knights, officially known as the German Order of the Teutonic Knights of St. Mary. There are others in the East, though, and elsewhere, including the Order of St. Thomas of Acre and the Order of St. Lazarus. Now, the Hospitallers, to go to number 2 first, they originated in a very modest foundation with the intention of sheltering pilgrims. They were established in Jerusalem, hence Jerusalem being in their official name, around the year 1070 by merchants from Amalfi in Italy, and they were connected to the Benedictine monastic order. From 1099, their little community in Jerusalem was endowed by the Franks living there in order to provide hospitality in Jerusalem. And this formed the beginnings of a new quasi-monastic order with St. John the Baptist as its patron. In 1113, the Pope took them under his protection and confirmed all the monetary and land donations that had been made to them. This is important because it kind of makes them like other monastic orders in that they were not subject to the local bishop or archbishop. Instead, they reported directly to the Pope. It's from about the year 1120 that the Hospitallers progressively get better known for military activity rather than just providing hospitality, as was their original function. The Templars, who were the best known of all of the three, they were founded after the conquest of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. Some knights decided to stay there to serve the canons of the Holy Sepulchre. And from their ranks of these knights who decided to stay on, a small group decided to live there according to a religious rule. So its mission from the beginning was the armed protection of pilgrims traveling to the Holy Lands. The Templars wore a white cloak with a red cross, and their banner was called the Bocent, which was half white, half black. Other orders, like the Order of St. Lazarus, their mission was to look after veterans of the Crusades who suffered from leprosy. So they founded a leper house in the Holy Lands, and at the same time as they founded a house to look after afflicted pilgrims and knights with leprosy, they received donations, estates of land, pilgrimages in the West. So their goal was to bring people together for common life of prayer, mutual aid, and nursing as well. Now, with the Teutonic Knights, as with the other orders like the Templars and the Hospitallers, their starting point was also a hospital, and it was that established at St. John of Acre by Germans, hence German order. So although there was a German hospital there in the first half of the 12th century, the real basis for the Teutonic Knights was a hospice reserved for German pilgrims during the time of the siege of Acre. And it was founded as a hospital by merchants from the German cities of Lübeck and Bremen, and it was entrusted to the care of the army of the Duke of Swabia in 1191. So it is pretty much all Germans for Germans. Linguistic divides in the Holy Lands, which we are well familiar with, meant that the French tended to go to their hospitals and the Germans went to their hospitals. So these different orders tend to get associated with particular nationalities, places of origin. They have a weird quasi-monastic, quasi-militaristic background. Laymen, that is not officially part of the church hierarchy, were the great majority of members. So they composed the categories of knights, who were increasingly only allowed to be knights in the orders if they were from noble backgrounds, and sergeants. And they could be sergeants at arms or sergeants of particular crafts. For the religious needs of these brothers, they also recruited their own priests or friars as chaplains. And then there would also have been a lot of servants, domestic personnel, or peasants who would have worked their lands. And these would have benefited from the spiritual aspect of the order without actually strictly being members of it. In both the Holy Lands and also in Spain, there were some orders in Spain, they also used slaves, and they recruited them among the Muslim prisoners in particular. So they fit in with a Crusader ideology because, as we know, after the First Crusade, a lot of Latin states were founded in the East. These had to be defended. So the Order of the Temple answered this need for defending it in particular. And they were given their rule, that is how they were to operate and be organized through the Council of Troy. They had the support of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and then the Crusade gave them an aim, while the temple itself, when they're associated with religious places, gave them a religious background. So they, through the history of the Templars, we can see how it is both religious and military too. And the model that was founded by the Templars are kind of responding to changing notions of what it meant to crusade. They have outposts in the West. While their headquarters were originally in the East, where their mission was based, they had outposts in the West who acted to raise money for them in the East and would send profits over to them as well. So you might think, how do you reconcile a military life with a religious life? Well, their rules were exactly that, rules to explain how this could be accomplished. They are very influenced by the rule of St. Benedict, and that is one of the first monastic rules created back in the 5th century. And they adapted the rules of St. Benedict according to St. Augustine's principles of just war. So they used early Christian thinkers to justify how I could have a religious and military outlook as well. So they were also directly subject to the Pope rather than the local bishop, which also enabled them to have more of a militaristic outlook. And they accepted free adults. They didn't have what in other communities might be called novitiates, so that is young people who were trained. They only got grown-ups completely willing to give themselves over. They follow, if we look at the Templars again, when they signed themselves over to the order, they had to follow 3 vows: obedience, chastity, and poverty. And those are the core vows that you would take if you were becoming a Benedictine monk as well. Women and children were not admitted in principle, but there were exceptions. The Hospitallers and several of the Spanish orders had solely female establishments as well. They had to go to Mass an awful lot. They were expected to be very pious. And they performed, and their origins were in religious functions, in that they were founded for charitable reasons, including the care of the sick. And back in the Middle Ages, those were pretty much exclusively functions carried out by the church. They also lived in communities. And this explains one of the primary sources that you had to read for class today. This is one that always stymies students. And in one of the primary sources, they are described as monks, and students are like, why are they described as monks? This doesn't really make sense. Well, they're sort of the on the surface aspects that are like being a monk is what leads them to be called this. They live in communities, they are quasi-religious. Like other monks, they do not answer to the local bishop, instead they answer to the Pope, and they are borrowing their themselves from the order, how monasteries are ordered and how they developed. They follow monastic rules. The Hospitallers, for example, as said, they follow the rules of St. Benedict. And their way of life was very monastic when they weren't fighting. Lots of prayers. They followed a very simple diet. They slept communally, so they had dormitories. They weren't expected to hold any personal property, even if they came from very wealthy, noble backgrounds. They had limited interaction with women. And all of this was set out in the rules, which you can also read in the primary sources. They directly administered charity, and up until this point, laymen, that is, people not in the church, had never done this before. Look, charity and hospital and healthcare was part of the church before this time. This is one of the first times that we have people not in the church visiting the sick, giving alms, looking after the sick. Bernard of Clairvaux, our friend from several classes, was a huge proponent of the Templars. And of course, he was a founder of the Cistercians. He thought that they were a great compromise for the need that they had at the time. And because of this connection with the Templars, with the Cistercians, the Templars also wore white habits, just like the Cistercians. So they had this visual evoking of the Cistercians. The Hospitallers, on the other hand, identified themselves with the Benedictines. As I said, they followed their rule. And so they only gradually became much more militaristic. They were originally much more religious in nature, but the militaristic came about because of really the social context that they found themselves in. So if we look at them in the Northern Crusades, we're dealing with particularly the Teutonic Knights, but there are also some others you'll read about, like the Sword Brothers, and their official title was the Brotherhood of the Knights of Christ. Military orders were really, really well suited to the actions of the Northern Crusades because they're used to a hard life. They're used to poverty and abstinence and following orders, and they're used to sticking with some things through really hard times too. They're also very innovative. We see them travel in the Baltic area, making good use of innovations, including those that they've learned from the Latin East. They have new types of ship. They build castles according to principles that they learned in the Holy Land. They also have new knowledge of artillery, like the crossbow. So they're very successful in applying things that they've learned from the East. The reason why they come to have such a big role in the Northern Crusades is because by the 13th century, it's become pretty apparent that it's very difficult to convert these pagan peoples to Christianity. Therefore, they turn to these military orders for, they thought maybe it would be better converting the locals from paganism. So they created new orders like the Order of Dublin, and they were based in Prussia, and the Knights of the Sword based in Livonia. And they fused with the Teutonic Knights, who still kept their lands and their interest rather in the Holy Lands, but they all became established in the Baltic regions. You can read in your readings a lot more about the Teutonic Knights and these other orders' role in the military conquest and colonization of the Baltic area. They are kind of the only ones who are loosely successful. The Teutonic Knights established their own states, the Teutonic states in the east, but the way that they form them in the likes of Livonia and Estonia, they're as much a product of German culture as they are of Latin Eastern culture. So the Teutonic Order had its own political state where they ruled huge parts of the area that they conquered in the north, but they were ultimately sort of gone by the end of the Middle Ages. They were defeated by the Poles and the Lithuanians at Tannenberg in 1410 and disappeared in 1525. Their Grand Master, because the leader of each of these groups is called the Grand Master, at this time, their Grand Master was a guy called Albert of Brandenburg. He converted to Lutheran Protestantism, because of course the Reformation happened by 1525, and secularized the Teutonic Knights, moved them away from the religious connotations. If we look at the other medieval military orders, we find that they are, yeah, they're products of the Middle Ages. They don't really survive into the early modern period, and their fates are pretty varied. The Hospitallers do kind of survive in a way. In 1291, there was the fall of Acre, obviously, and the Hospitallers were centred at Acre by this time. When they lost Acre, the Hospitallers moved back to Cyprus. From 1306, they conquered the island of Rhodes, and they settled there around 1310. They also had Malta, where they adapted themselves by holding naval power there and on Rhodes. But at the same time as being naval powers, they still kept up the charitable activities that were associated with its beginnings. And so we kind of see that function being fulfilled to this day, because we still have the Knights of the Order of Malta. And they, over a long period of time, really oversimplifying things, emerged out of the original Hospitallers. The Templars famously came to a bad end. The Order of the Temple was suppressed by the French king, Philip the Fair. He arrested the Templars within France on the 13th of October, 1307. And at this point, it was an unheard of procedure to suppress an order like this. And it led to the last Grand Master of the Templars, called Jacques de Molay, being burned at the stake in 1314. And you might be like, oh my God, why did it get to that point? Well, you see, because they had outposts in the West, the Templars in particular seized this as an opportunity for banking and getting involved in banking. And this makes complete sense when you think about it in terms of, you are going out on crusade, you're going to the East, you need a lot of money to take with you. There are no banks like we're used to it today. There's no credit cards or anything like that. So what are your options? Well, you could bring all of your money with you, but guess what? You're probably going to get robbed. It'll get known that, oh, look, these so-called pilgrims are carrying huge sums of money with them. Let's rob them as they pass through Hungary or Constantinople or Cyprus or where have you. So muggings and robberies of pilgrims was a real problem. And the orders, in particular the Templars, offered a real good solution to this, whereby you could deposit with them back in your home country in the West the amount of money that you need, and then they would write you a letter saying so-and-so has deposited X amount of money with us, and then you could cash it in as you went. You go to the local branch of whatever that order is, turn over your piece of paper and be like, hey, I need some money. I've left an account with the guys off in France or wherever you came from, and then they would release some of the money you'd already lodged with them. So pretty similar to how we bank today, in fact. And it was a really successful way of doing things, but of course, it made them very, very, very wealthy, and Fred caught the eye of the French king as a result. Okay, so where else do we have? We've got the Spanish orders. There's orders in those same principles in Spain, because we know all about the Reconquista there. Once the Latins had been expelled from the Holy Land and the last Lithuanian pagans had converted, that took them up until the late 14th century. And then the very last sort of crusading, loosely interpreted action was the fall of the Muslim kingdom of Granada, 1492. Even the Spanish orders did not really have a reason to go on. The reason for their existence had gone. The Order of St. Lazarus, they, after 1291 and the fall of Acre, moved to Europe permanently, and they lost control of their leper houses, despite the fact that the Pope was really in favour of them looking after the lepers compared to everybody else. But they kind of just lost touch with one another because they weren't as well organised. So this means that these, while they're sort of enduring fascination to lots of people, including students, they really are very medieval, these different military orders, and definitely reflective of a very medieval outlook.